They surmised she was merely another African-American woman who aroused suspicion. They possessed no awareness that she stood as the most influential legal representative in the state. The hour grew late, surpassing 11 p.m., but Monica Jefferson did not hasten. She had dedicated the entire day within the courthouse, transitioning between a multitude of cases, her intellect a perpetual arena of arguments, substantiating evidence, and concluding remarks. At that juncture, her sole aspiration involved replenishing her automobile's fuel supply and returning to her domicile. She steered into a Chevron service station situated in Birmingham, Alabama, expelling a deliberate exhalation as the fuel dispenser emitted an activating signal. The radiant illumination from the overhead fixtures projected elongated shadows across the concrete expanse. The tranquil murmuring of the nocturnal environment was disrupted solely by the infrequent passage of automobiles accelerating along the adjacent thoroughfare. Monica extended her hand toward the fuel nozzle, her contemplations drifting elsewhere. Perhaps she would indulge in a goblet of wine upon her return home. Conceivably, she might at last complete the literary work resting upon her bedside table. She remained oblivious to the arrival of the patrol vehicle until the forceful closure of its portals reverberated. 2 law enforcement personnel emerged. One, a seasoned individual with expansive shoulders, embodying an aura of authority that commanded obedience. The other, a younger, more eager subordinate, attentively observing his superior for instructions. Sergeant Greg Matheson and Officer Kyle Barker. She perceived their scrutiny even prior to turning her head. That very gaze she had witnessed unfold repeatedly within the confines of courtrooms. "Ma'am," Matheson declared, advancing toward her with purposeful stride, "we are going to need to observe some form of identification." Monica's fingers faltered upon the dispenser. She glanced upward, already anticipating the direction this interaction would take. Routine inspection. His intonation was concise, rehearsed. She scrutinized them momentarily. No other individuals populated the station. No one else was undergoing questioning. Only she. Monica emitted a protracted exhalation and extracted her wallet from her handbag. "I shall present my identification," she articulated, her vocal tone even. "But first, enlighten me as to the rationale for your interception." Barker advanced. "We received a report concerning a purloined black Lexus in the proximate vicinity. Your vehicle corresponds to the provided description." Monica nearly emitted a vocal expression of amusement. She had possessed this particular automobile for a duration of 4 years. The license plates were duly registered under her given appellation. The insurance policy, similarly, bore her name. "A stolen vehicle? Who reported it as such?" she inquired. Matheson's ocular orbs narrowed. "Let us refrain from rendering this more convoluted than necessary." Monica remained stationary. She had managed far more severe predicaments than this. Murder trials, instances of federal corruption, lawbreakers with everything to forfeit. However, she comprehended the futility of disputing in a circumstance of this nature. She relinquished her identification, maintaining a neutral countenance as Matheson accepted it. Barker circumnavigated the vehicle, gliding a hand across the hood as though assessing it for evidentiary material. "I require you to remove yourself from the vicinity of the automobile," Matheson commanded. Monica's reservoir of patience diminished. "You possess my identification. Scrutinize it. You shall ascertain that this vehicle is mine." Barker halted at the driver's side door, peering inside through the window. "Is that a professional satchel?" Monica adhered to his gaze. Her leather briefcase, the very one she carried each and every day to the courthouse, rested upon the passenger seat. "Engage the trunk mechanism," Matheson instructed. Monica arched an eyebrow. "Negative." He advanced closer. "Excuse me." "You lack probable cause," she asserted, composedly. "My identification is valid, and this automobile is legally mine. You possess no entitlement to search it." A fleeting expression of irritation traversed Matheson's visage. He pivoted toward Barker, communicated in. This was a juncture at which matters escalated into hazard. Monica had witnessed it excessively, the rapidity with which predicaments of this kind could spiral downward. She could discern Barker's articulation over the radio, communicating with dispatch. Monica's cardiac rhythm accelerated. not from trepidation, but from a piercing, burgeoning exasperation. She had committed her entire professional existence to rectifying this, to holding law enforcement personnel, such as these, accountable. And now, here she found herself. Matheson folded his upper limbs across his thoracic region, observing her as one might a quandary necessitating resolution. "Ma'am, we are going to necessitate that you remove yourself from the vicinity of the automobile." Monica remained stationary, yet she recognized that this incident would not conclude at this point. "Should I decline?" Matheson's expression darkened. "Then we shall be compelled to undertake this by more onerous means." Monica perceived the atmospheric shift. The instant Matheson squared his shoulder regions, his stance evolving to a more rigid, more forceful posture. She had dedicated sufficient temporal duration within the courtroom, dissecting the nonverbal communication of law enforcement personnel, to anticipate the impending events. "Ma'am, I should not reiterate my inquiry," Matheson stated, his vocalization tightening. "Remove yourself from the vicinity of the automobile." Monica's pulse maintained a steady rhythm. She had contested against individuals of his ilk within the courthouse, deconstructing their justifications upon the witness stand. However, here, upon this dimly illuminated filling station lot, no judge presided, no jury was convened, merely unbridled power. Barker's manual extremity hovered proximate to his belt. Tension crackled in the space between them. Monica could perceive her own cardiac pulsation, steadfast and calculated, as she deliberated upon her subsequent course of action. "Sergeant," she uttered, her vocal tone tranquil, measured, "you are cognizant of the illegality of this." Matheson exhaled sharply through his nasal passages. "You are resisting a lawful directive." "There exists nothing lawful pertaining to it," Monica countered. She ought to have recognized it. It was inconsequential. Barker initiated the inaugural maneuver. His hand shot forth, grasping her wrist with a level of force that communicated that this was no longer concerned with a traffic infraction. This pertained to command. Prior to her ability to react, Matheson seized her alternative upper limb, contorting both extremities behind her dorsal region. "Are you being serious?" Monica hissed, twisting slightly. "Desist resisting," Barker snapped. She was not, yet they necessitated her to be perceived as such. Cold metallic material encircled her carpal regions. The resounding snap of the restraints locking into position reverberated in the prevailing silence. "You possess no entitlement," Matheson interrupted. "You are under arrest for failure to comply." Monica clenched her mandibular region. This was rudimentary. Incite the suspect to agitation. Escalate the circumstance. Validate the utilization of coercion. It was all remarkably predictable. They pivoted her, pressing her against the lateral exterior of the vehicle. The abrasive texture of Barker's gloved manual extremity pressed against her shoulder region with studied deliberation. "Do you possess anything upon your person that I ought to be apprised of?" Barker inquired, patting down her pockets with studied deceleration. Monica stared forward. "Scrutinize the handbag," Matheson directed. Barker grasped it from the hood, forcibly extracting it open. Wallet, keys, courtroom identification badge. His motions decelerated. "Sarge." Matheson glanced over at what Barker had produced, a leather enclosure. He flipped it open. Monica's official identification stared back at them. State Prosecutor's Office, Chief Prosecutor. For a moment, silence prevailed. Then Matheson snatched it from Barker's manual extremity, ocular orb scanning the embossed lettering. The resplendent state emblem glimmered beneath the fluorescent illuminations. The chromatic tone of his facial region diminished. "You are committing an error," Monica stated, her articulation composed yet tinged with sharpness. Matheson blinked, processing the information. Barker shifted, experiencing unease. "Sarge, where are directives?" Matheson hesitated. The magnitude of what they had just executed was inundating him in real time. They had just attained the very individual overseeing their own division's investigation into patterns of racial profiling. And now they were trapped. "Remove the restraints," Matheson muttered. Barker remained stationary. "I stipulated, remove the infernal restraints." Barker fumbled. the acoustic friction of metallic substances scraping against one another as he disengaged them. Monica massaged her carpal extremities, vigilantly observing both of them. "Listen," Matheson initiated. Forcing a rigid lip smile, this constituted a misunderstanding. However, Monica did not smile. She slowly retrieved her identification, slipping it into her outer garment pocket. "Indeed," she replied, ocular orbs affixed upon his. It was. Nevertheless, misunderstandings do not encompass the utilization of restraints. And this is not concluded. Monica remained immobile, her carpal extremities aching from the confines of restraints, the gravity of the moment exerting pressure upon the two individuals positioned before her. Matheson exhibited the countenance of an individual who had just unintentionally stepped off a precipice. Barker, younger and less seasoned, perpetually shifted upon his lower limbs, his phalangeal digits twitching at his lateral expanses. "This need not progress further," Matheson articulated, his vocalization compelled into something resembling control. "Let us merely proceed onward." Monica permitted the articulation to settle. Proceed onward? She had devoted her professional trajectory to advocating for individuals who never garnered the opportunity to proceed onward. Individuals who were forcibly extracted from their conveyances, forcefully propelled onto the concrete pavement, subjected to humiliation before their familial units, all because of law enforcement personnel who perceived them as a quandary, not as human beings. She inhaled slowly, deliberately. "You detained me without cause. You utilized restraints upon me. You conducted an unlawful search. And now, you desire to depart from the circumstance." Matheson swallowed. "We were unaware of your identity." Monica's ocular orbs narrowed. "And if I were not the chief prosecutor, would we continue to engage in this discourse? Or would I be positioned within the posterior compartment of your patrol vehicle at this present juncture?" Neither individual furnished a response. Barker, at long last, glanced upward, his facial visage exhibiting uncertainty. "We were merely executing our occupational obligations." Monica emitted a sharp exhalation, that pretext, that fatigued, indolent pretext. She advanced a step forward, reducing her vocal intensity sufficiently to compel them to attend. "You presume this concludes at this location? You presume that, by virtue of the removal of the restraints, this vanishes entirely?" She inclined her cranium. "Enlighten me. For what duration have you served within the law enforcement division?" Barker hesitated. 5 years. Monica pivoted toward Matheson. "And you?" His mandibular region clenched. 18. 18 years, she echoed. Sufficient temporal duration to comprehend better. Matheson exhaled through his nasal passages, his manual extremities resting upon his hip regions as though fortify himself. "What do you seek from us?" Monica scrutinized him. "I seek for you to retain recollection of this present moment, because, during the subsequent occasion upon which you intercept an individual bearing resemblance to myself, but who lacks this," she elevated her identification badge, permitting the gravity of its import to permeate, "they shall not possess the identical capacity to retaliate." She permitted the prevailing silence to protract. Barker shifted anew, his countenance strained, his ocular orbs darting between her and a collaborator. Ultimately, Matheson communicated, "Listen, we erred. I comprehend it." Monica shook her cranium. "Negative. You do not. However, you shall." Matheson initiated the aperture of his oral cavity. Yet, prior to his ability to articulate any verbiage, the crackling emissions from Barker's radio intercepted the environment. Unit 27, status verification pertaining to that vehicular interception. The dispatcher. Someone else possessed awareness of this interaction at this present juncture. Now Barker hesitated, glancing toward Matheson for guidance. Matheson exhaled sharply. "Communicate to them that we are in the clear." Barker hesitated, a solitary second exceeding the permissible threshold. Guilt constitutes a substantial burden to bear. Eventually, however, he depressed the activation mechanism. Unit 27, all clear. Monica nodded. Commendable. Now, I propose that you both proceed to your domiciles and engage in substantial contemplation pertaining to the events that have just transpired." She pivoted toward her conveyance, extending her manual extremity toward the portal handle. However, then, as though something had just clicked into position, a sluggish comprehension crept into Matheson's cognitive processes. "Which department did you stipulate you were employed by?" he inquired circumspectly. Monica smiled, yet no warmth emanated from it. "I did not." She slid into her seating arrangement, sealed the portal, and initiated the motive power source. As she propelled herself away from the location, she possessed no exigency to inspect the reflective viewing apparatus in order to ascertain that they were still positioned there, their respective realities instantaneously experiencing a diminution in scale relative to their dimensions a mere 10 minutes prior, because they had just wrongfully apprehended the woman administering the inquiry into their own operational department. And on the subsequent diurnal cycle, they would awake and confront a nocturnal phantasm. They couldn't distance themselves from what happened. The subsequent morning, Monica sat at her writing surface, her attention fixated upon the collection of case archives positioned before her. The ironic dimensions of the circumstances were not mislaid upon her. For a protracted duration of months, she had been critically analyzing grievance petitions lodged against law enforcement personnel within the Birmingham Police Department, each one delineating established tendencies of racial selectivity in enforcement procedures, unreasonable applications of exertion, and unlawful interceptive protocols. Each one was replete with nominal appellations of human beings who had undergone humiliation, apprehension, or more grievous outcomes, all of the law enforcement personnel committing errors. And now, her own nominal designation belonged inscribed within one of those very archives. A percussive impact against the portal extracted her from her contemplations. Her administrative assistant, Clara Rodriguez, protruded her cephalic region into the space. "They have arrived." Monica exhaled, directum inwards. The portal manifested a widening gyration, and Police Chief Walter Grayson traversed the threshold, his manifestation taut and indecipherable. Trailing him, Internal Affairs Investigator Samuel Owens carried a manila holding device grasped below his brachial region. They eschewed the expenditure of temporal duration upon courteous formalities. Grayson liberated his respiratory tract. "I have scrutinized the cinematographic depiction." Monica's manual extremities performed an iterative percussive impact upon the terminal expanses of her writing surface. The surveillance apparatus at the service station had captured the entirety of the circumstances. "I surmise that you also scrutinized a segment wherein they placed me within corporal restraints?" she inquired, in a composed tone. Grayson's labial expanses compressed into a slender demarcation. "I shall not defend their actions. The events of the preceding nocturne were untenable." Monica inclined her cephalic region. "Then you already possess the cognitions of the impending consequences." Owen positioned the holding device terminal wards, executing a gyration to unfold it. Interior wards, disciplinary reports were arrayed. Matheson's and Barker's appellations were affixed across multiple grievance petitions. Monica glanced terminal wards. "How numerous?" Grayson hesitated. Monica glanced cephalicwards in a piercing manner. "How numerous?" Owens furnished a response instead. 14 grievance petitions against Matheson, 9 grievance petitions against Barker, predominantly assertions pertaining to racial predisposition. Monica permitted that cognitive input to sink inward, and notwithstanding, they were still patrolling the thoroughfares. She leaned dorsally within her seating arrangement. "You know, when I inaugurated my inquiry into the specific department, I harbored a theoretical hypothesis." She intertwined her manual extremities. "I surmised that the difficulty resided within the systemic framework, that directorial leadership perpetually elected to disregard the events. However, during the events of preceding nocturne, I obtained a novel comprehension." Grayson's ocular orbs flickered. "And what insight did you acquire?" She sustained his visual focus. "The difficulty does not exclusively reside within the systemic framework. It also encompasses that law enforcement personnel bearing the characteristics of Matheson and Barker harbor the conviction that they exist beyond the reach of punitive repercussions." Grayson shifted, I shall be mandating the placement of both of them upon administrative sabbatical." "That is insufficient," Monica interrupted. Owens vigilantly observed her. "What are your desires?" She leaned anteriorwards, her vocal articulation firm. "I desire for them to be relinquished from the operational forces." Grayson tensed. "Monica, you harbor the cognizance of the difficulty inherent in the act of terminating a law enforcement operative who receives safeguarding from union affiliations. Even accounting for the cinematographic depiction, the procedural itinerary for appeal could protract for a duration of months. Then let us ensure that they do not initiate an appeal." Grayson exhaled sharply, utilizing a manual extremity to rub across his facial region. "You are soliciting that I cast them directly into the mandibular elements of the canine species." Monica's manifestation underwent no modifications. "Negative. I am soliciting that you hold them accountable. For once." Owen shifted within his seating arrangement. "Should we initiate legal accusations against them, the departmental entity shall sustain a negative impact. It is already undergoing pronounced critical examination." Monica emitted a curt expression of amusement. "You harbor solicitude pertaining to the department's public image? I was subjected to humiliation, even placed within carpal restraints, and unlawfully detained by 2 law enforcement operatives with preceding historical account of impropriety. Should you presume that I shall permit this circumstance to be relinquished from my attention, then you are utterly unacquainted with my character." An extended duration of silence settled amongst them. Grayson exhaled. "Which legal accusations are you recommending?" Monica exhibited no hesitation. "Unlawful detainment, impropriety, and abusive exploitation of power." Grayson's shoulder regions exhibited indications of sagging. He harbored the cognizance that there existed no avenue for evading the situation. "Acceptable." Owens nodded. "I shall commence the drafting of the documentation." Monica assumed an erect position. "And one supplementary consideration." They both gazed toward her. "I desire communicative media assemblage." Grayson exhibited a furrowing of the brow. "Are you certain with respect to that?" Monica's ocular orbs underwent a darkening process. "I have concluded my engagement with managing matters quietly. It has arrived at the juncture wherein the public possesses comprehensive cognizance of specifically who exists to ensure their safeguarding. Because, should Matheson and Barker possess a capacity to perform actions of this nature toward her, an individual manifesting power and influence, what were they perpetrating toward individuals devoid of a vocal expression? This was not solely concerned with considerations of justice. This was directed toward ensuring that such events did not reoccur. The courtroom space was populated to its dimensional capacity. Reporters arrayed the dorsal partition, photographic capturing mechanisms clicking at iterative sequential instances. The public assemblage space overflowed with observants, communal membership, activists, alternative law enforcement operatives, observing the itinerary in silence. At the defendant's writing surface, Sergeant Greg Matheson and Officer Kyle Barker sat arrayed in rigid, formal raiment, their identifying badges relinquished from their attire, their respective prospects rendered uncertain. Barker was visually directed downward toward the writing surface, his manual extremities conjoined with such compressive rigidity that his osseous articulations manifested a whitening and chromatic tone. Matheson, with a clenched mandibular region, was visually directed with no deviation, his manifestation exhibiting a meticulously constructed blankness. Monica traversed inwards, the percussive acoustic emissions of her pedal extremities impacting upon the refined expanses of the terrestrial layer. She had prosecuted lawbreakers, corrupt public functionaries, even law enforcement operatives aforetimes. However, this differed from precedent instances. This temporal juncture witnessed her concurrently assuming the persona of both the prosecutor and the casualty. She assumed her seating arrangement, positioning her notations downward upon the writing surface. Today, the circumstances were not exclusively concentrated upon those 2 individual men. The circumstances extended to encompass the entirety of the systemic framework that had permitted them to function without inhibitory interventions. The presiding judicial authority traversed inwards, requesting the maintenance of ordered conduct within the courtroom space. The itinerary was initiated. The prosecuting judicial officer, Monica's counterpart, Assistant District Attorney Leonard Briggs, assumed an erect position. Your Honor, the representatives of the legal entity shall substantiate that the defendants, Sergeant Greg Matheson and Officer Kyle Barker, engaged in an unlawful detention, violated the legally established entitlements of the casualty, and abused their authoritative capacity under the guise of governmental validation. Matheson's legally retained advocate, Victor Langley, arose subsequently, his vocal articulation manifesting smoothness and practical experience. Your Honor, my clientele acted within the sphere of their prescribed occupational responsibilities. This was a misunderstanding, not an intentional act of transgression. A misunderstanding? Monica maintained her manifestation, devoid of expression. A misunderstanding does not inherently encompass the application of corporal restraints. Briggs summoned the inaugural witness, the service station director. I was in internal wards, vigilantly observing the surveillance apparatuses. The male individual testified. She was solely performing the act of replenishing her conveyance with combustible fuel. Then those two manifested themselves, and one could discern with immediate perspicacity that they were not present with motivations of assistance. Briggs initiated the replay of the surveillance cinematographic depiction. Each respective temporal unit of the wrongful interceptive procedure transpired upon the visual projection apparatus, the instant Matheson necessitated identification, the instant Barker circumnavigated conveyance, the instant Monica was forcibly seized, forcibly constrained, and corporal restraint devices were engaged, and then the instant their respective facial countenances underwent transformations subsequent to scrutinizing her identifying badge. Briggs permitted the cinematographic depiction to persist its gyration for an additive protracted temporal duration, permitting the gravity of its impact to settle within the chamber. Do these law enforcement operatives manifest any rationale for initiating the apprehension procedure? He inquired. Negative, sir, the director responded. They solely desired to. Matheson shifted within his seating arrangement. Barker sustained his cephalic region directed downward. Subsequently, Barker was summoned to provide testimony. He hesitated, glancing toward Matheson prior to ultimately assuming an erect position and conducting his transferal toward the testimonial platform. Briggs leaned anteriorwards. Officer Barker, let's engage in discourse pertaining to that nocturne. When you approached Miss Jefferson, of what transgression did you harbor suspicion? Barker deglutinated. There existed a report pertaining to a purloined conveyance, corresponding with the descriptive characteristics. Briggs elevated a brow region. Did you substantiate the validity of the report anterior to approaching her? Barker hesitated. Negative. Not at that specific temporal juncture. Briggs advanced closer. Therefore, you possess no factual rationale to harbor suspicion toward her? Barker shifted. We, solely desire to ascertain certitude. Briggs pivoted toward the panel of jury members. Solely desire to ascertain certitude. That constitutes the employed reasoning? Not probable justification. Not evidentiary material. Merely a visceral sensory impression. He pivoted dorsally toward Barker. At which temporal locus did you procure cognizance that you had detained the chief prosecutorial official of this designated jurisdictional expanse? Barker's facial expanses manifested redness. Subsequent to our examination of her identification documentation, and notwithstanding, you had previously placed her within corporal restraint devices? An extended duration of silence protracted. Barker ultimately muttered, Affirmative. Matheson's legally retained advocate lodged an objection. However, the prejudicial impact had already been sustained. During the temporal juncture wherein Monica received the summoning to assume the testimonial platform, she verbalized in an articulate, steadfast tonal character. I have expended my professional itinerary to ensure the equitable maintenance of procedural regulation under the parameters of the legal system, she communicated to the chamber. These law enforcement operatives treated me primarily as a lawbreaker, secondarily as a citizen. The singular rationale for my presence at this juncture, in lieu of being confined within a detention facility, derives from my employment nominal designation that should elicit a sense of dread within each respective individual position within this chamber. Her vocalizations were suspended within the atmospheric medium. Matheson's facial expanses exhibited a stone-like rigidity. However, Barker manifested a smaller physical dimension, akin to a male individual acquiring the comprehension, subsequently, that he had ruined his own existence. Briggs pivoted toward the jury panel. The officially sanctioned regulations are transparent. These male individuals have exploited their authoritative power. The temporal duration has arrived to hold them accountable. And for the inaugural temporal juncture, throughout their operational itineraries, Matheson and Barker did not serve as the controlling authorities. The verdict was delivered more expeditiously than anticipated. Monica sat motionless as the jury foreman assumed an erect posture, audibly liberating his respiratory tract. We, the jury panel, ascertained the guilt of the defendants on each respective designated accusation. A ripple of vocalized articulations proliferated through the courtroom expanses. Reporters vigorously scribbled within their notations. Matheson's superior expanses underwent tension. His veneer of indifference was eroded. For the inaugural instance, Barker liberated a shaky emission of respiratory air, visually directing himself toward the writing surface, as though willing his own ontological annihilation. The judicial authorities' gavel percussively impacted the wooden surface. Sentencing procedures shall be prescribed at a subsequent temporal designation. This juridical entity is adjourned. The temporal instant the judicial authority relinquished the chamber, the space erupted. Photographic illumination. Devices flashed in rapid succession. Reporters propelled themselves anteriorwards. Vocalizations overlapped. Miss Jefferson, do you hold the conviction that justice has been furnished? Do you harbor the theoretical hypothesis that this specific lawsuit shall institute a precedent? What verbal communications do you intend to deliver toward those who substantiate these law enforcement operatives? Monica confronted the communicative media entity head-on, assuming a position anteriorward in reference to the microphone, recording apparatus with the identical composed equilibrium that she had maintained from the temporal instant she was forcibly directed into the carpal restraint devices. Permit my articulations to manifest transparency, she articulated, her vocal manifestation steadfast yet rigid. This specific case has never been concerned with retribution. It has been concerned with accountability. She scanned the population of photographic capturing apparatuses. This specific case matters, due to its demonstration of a verity that we already harbored. When the operational system functions, deficient law enforcement operatives do not navigate away from repercussions devoid of repercussions. However, such a consequence should not necessitate a courtroom chamber, a high-profile trial, or the appropriate nominal designation of employment in order for an individual to procure justice. The gravitative burden of those vocalizations settled across the congregation. Sergeant Matheson and Officer Barker harbored the conviction that they could operate with no ensuing repercussions. That particular conviction terminates today. She permitted her gaze to gyrate across the photographic capturing apparatuses. And should there exist alternative individuals adorning an identifying badge who concurrently share that specific mindset, permit this discourse to serve as your advisory warning. With that action, she executed a dorsal gyration, disregarding the subsequent fusillade of raised queries. The provision of justice had been executed. However, her vocational endeavors remained distanced from their point of cessation. Matheson and Barker had been officially relinquished of their identifying badges. Barker, owing to his diminished participation, garnered probational status and community engagement activities. Matheson, with his protracted historical account of impropriety, was sentenced to 2 temporal years of confinement within a federal penal institution. For the inaugural temporal instance in his biographical itinerary, he would be positioned on the alternative delineation of legal boundaries. And notwithstanding, the triumphal consummation evoked a feeling of emptiness. Monica sat ensconced within her professional writing space one diurnal iteration subsequently, visually directed exteriorwards through the transparent expanses as the urban locale proceeded with its routine itineration. For each respective specific legal proceeding of this designation, how profuse remained unheard, how profuse numbers of human beings had undergone being intercepted, subjected to a searching procedure, undergoing apprehension, subjected to humiliatory treatment, and had never procured the opportunity to retaliate. She extended her reach toward the archive positioned upon her writing surface, a recent legal case, another grievance, another appellation appended to the formal inventory. She emitted an exhalation and then initiated a gyration to disclose it. Because the attainment of justice did not equate to a singular temporal instant, it equated to a protracted confrontation, and she had not yet attained the cessation of her engagement. What transpired with Monica was all too ubiquitous. However, the discriminatory element that rendered this legal case diverse in comparison with precedential circumstances equated to the power that she wielded, power that majority of casualties do not acquire. Hypothetically, should she have been solely another African-American woman positioned at a filling station, devoid of an identifying badge, devoid of authoritative sway, solely an individual aspiring to return domiciliarywards, would those law enforcement operatives have manifested an apology? Would they have permitted her to relocate away from the locale? Or would they have substantiated and validated their implemented courses of action until she was confined in proximity to detention bars, functioning as a numerical data point, another instance of miscomprehension concealed beneath terrestrial expanses? This narrative documentation does not solely appertain to two deficient law enforcement operatives forfeiting their source of monetary sustenance. This narrative documentation is directed toward a defective operational framework that permits law enforcement operatives exhibiting characteristics consistent with those manifested by the prior appellations to exist and prosper. Therefore, direct your interpersonal inquiries toward yourselves. How numerous additional individuals remain at liberty, and how numerous additional instances shall it necessitate prior to the occurrence of authentically significant alteration? Should you place credence in the concept of accountability, and should you place credence in the concept that equitable legal provision should not derive exclusively from established social positioning, please redistribute this narrative documentation. The elevated numerical quantities of human beings who are exposed to this specific documentation shall render its circumvention more complicated. And, should you have not already executed the process, enroll and subscribe for alternative narrative documentations that subject the operational framework to confrontation and that necessitate the divulgation of authenticity. Because the adversarial engagement has not undergone cessation. Not yet.